on the classic state or free-to-air or digital platforms that exist in the marketplace. So for a lot of the minority sports, and it's perhaps unfair to call them minority sports because in reality their participant bases are not dissimilar and sometimes actually eclipse those of the bigger sports in the country. I think the statistics have actually proven that many of these sports actually have higher participation levels than the likes of rugby in this marketplace. So I think what is going to happen and what YouTube is facilitating is a situation whereby the content owner can effectively have their own channel properly branded, properly optimized, put onto the YouTube platform, which, as opposed to the historic model, where people would post their own videos, upload their own videos, and they'd be lost. They'd effectively have no structure, and there'd be no way of actually finding them. So I think the way that YouTube is approaching it makes absolute sense, and people want to go to either live and or exclusive content. Whether it's live, delayed, highlights, clips, whatever, they want to know that it's exclusive. Also, for the rights owner, they want to make sure that no one is plagiarizing their signal. Now, YouTube does this in real time. If anything gets uploaded or posted that is effectively irregular or does not have clearance, literally it's instantaneous. It will come off. Now, the responsibility ultimately vests with the rights owner. So virtually all sports will have at some point uploaded some content onto YouTube, and they're probably aware of other content that is not official and is not properly branded. And this whole policing argument is a major bone of contention. But given that it's in the sports interest, the actual, the true rights owner, to monetize this, it's imperative that you consolidate and get tenure of all of the IP possible. And if that means effectively blocking other sites, then that's now possible courtesy of YouTube. I mean, obviously, America's Cup is dear to this country's heart, but you can see how in France, L'Equipe, the major sports newspaper, has developed its own online platform, Dailymotion, and they're now providing coverage of the America's Cup World Series. Perform, which is a listed company in the UK, has had phenomenal success. Effectively, it's what, in many respects, has spurred YouTube on, because Perform was set up very much with a mandate to provide sports broadcast content, and in their case, their financial model was betting driven. So betting can be obviously quite a sensitive issue in many markets, but what Perform recognized is that there's a absolute appetite for people to bet live or in running. In many markets, particularly the UK now, 50% of all bets are done in running, i.e. during the sports competition itself, as opposed to ante-post or pre-tournament. So obviously for a lot of sports, they've actually recognized the benefit of teaming up with Perform, and Perform will have a portfolio of 6 betting companies, and those betting companies will effectively be able to window those sports in real time on their own sites in exchange for effectively a share of the betting income or at least a flat fee. So I think that's an interesting model. I don't pretend to be totally up to speed with the legislation in this marketplace and what TAB or the government's plans are, but obviously that's another legitimate income stream in most other markets. The important thing is people say, how much does all this cost? As we know, there are a number of ways of uploading content, and the quality ranges significantly, but it doesn't necessarily impair the amount of viewership to particular clips. Here's 3 examples. So AC Milan players singing on a train, actually 1.8 million views, and that was just literally done with a handheld iPhone. So that's indicative. Obviously, webcams can be fixed. I mean, before I came to Rotorua, I was able to go onto the webcam and check the environment and the weather, etc. So here, obviously, people actually putting webcams into stadia. And in this case, this was for the opening of the new Juventus Stadium, 70,000 live views at the time that it opened, and people continuing to view it on a regular basis. Perhaps more pertinent because of the Manchester derby today, because Premier League has an absolute lockdown with Sky and BBC on the rights, the closest people can get is obviously in the tunnel before the players come onto the pitch. So what they've done in Manchester City at the Etihad Stadium is actually again put a webcam in place. It might sound fairly innocuous, but it's had over 20 million views. Just people watching people in the tunnel, you know, the Vincent Kompanies and the Agueros of this world, but it has an audience. Now, coming back to, as I say, that crude translation of circa $5,000 per million, it all adds up. And so that's another sort of relevant example.
Just before you move on there, curious on the current model with YouTube, is the onus on the rights holder to both cover the cost and pay for production? And then is there any standard that is expected by YouTube, or do they make sure that it's of a certain quality before they allow it to be broadcast?
YouTube, yeah, all the responsibility is with the rights owner. So they just want to take a clean feed, and what I mean by clean feed, it's a legitimate feed. So it's come from the true rights owner. In terms of, you know, the production qualities, production values, they don't have any minimum thresholds. So it's very much in the rights owner's interest to make sure that it's of a decent quality. But what I'm saying now is that because of the standard of smartphones and the megapixels and the investment that's going into the hardware anyway is making that experience perfectly legitimate. Particularly because the top 6 YouTube sports videos of all time, only one of them with Zidane, it would be what I would call a proper high quality production. Most of the others are almost like jackass type clips of extreme sports or minority sports. So I think it's more evidential that the younger generation are more accepting. They almost expect YouTube to be edgier. It doesn't have to be the full 3D HD experience. But no, in reality, YouTube basically just want to take the signal, and they're not going to put any money up for production.
How does that work with the action replays, the analysis and those sort of things? It's still be fed through. How would you do that?
I think in terms of the concurrency, depending on what broadcast deals have been done with any particular event or format, YouTube effectively will be there as the recipient. So through satellite uplinking, they will take whatever an event is being produced, they'll literally be able to simulcast it onto their platform. So, you know, they're encouraging more and more federations to come to them. They've taken a top-down policy, so they've done deals with FIFA and many of the other major leagues, but that's not to the exclusion of other sports. I mean, recently, for example, fencing, not one of the world's biggest sports, the FIE had their World Championships, a 10-day event in October of last year, and they had 350,000 peak views during the tournament. Even the dog show Crufts, which you might have heard of, they had over 100,000 views to that. So it is fast becoming apparent that a lot of sports who wouldn't candidly get any airtime anyplace else are now recognizing that YouTube is a great footprint. I mean, 800 million, put that into context, you know, and this is what I was saying yesterday. When you consider New Zealand only has 1.6 million homes, and there are 1.8 billion homes worldwide, you obviously have to export as best possible your rights and see how best you can monetize it. I think when I looked the Haka, I think it was probably over 10 million views, was the highest rating Haka video, and there are a number of them on YouTube. But that was put up by an individual, and that dated back about 5 years, more or less at the inception of YouTube itself. So I think it's very much proving to be an open platform, and one which is a nice either complement to existing deals that have been done with other broadcasters, or for those that haven't been able to get a window, it's a great new way of developing one. Sorry, the point of this slide was just we know how stats-based sports has become. Interestingly, Bernie, there was a reference from Bruce today, he mentioned, he quipped in passing, but Bernie Ecclestone still believes that the internet is a passing fad. He just hasn't adopted the new technology, which is why F1 has not done any major internet broadcast deal. the best you can get, you can spend £19.99, best part of $40 to buy a timing app, which in real time will show you sector timing, the 3 sectors of an F1 race, and you'll get a virtual simulcast or representation of the race, but nothing in real form. So this is something that MotoGP have also done, and they're probably the most successful premium apps in the world market at the moment. But I think what's interesting is how you can integrate that sort of technology for other sports, and there's no reason why, if those 2 sports have been able to charge such a huge premium, and admittedly they have massive viewer bases and followings, but it just shows how you don't even need a video signal to actually attract a discrete income stream. People are stats mad, they want stats. So I think sports companies and federations, associations have to be prepared to give them as much as possible in that regard. We mentioned Virtual Eye yesterday, and obviously Hawkeye, and this is, again, you can see how people are circumventing the lack of a live signal. It's been done particularly in cricket. People who don't get a live stream can at least see a virtual representation of it. Another interesting development, which I'm sure will come here if it's not already been here today, Supernor, a Scandinavian company, what they recognise is that a number of international broadcasts are effectively being broadcast worldwide, but that the sponsors are wholly irrelevant to the market in which they're being broadcast. So take, for example, rugby. Obviously, if the autumn internationals and England are playing, sort of Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand, they're more than likely going to have a Carlsberg or a Heineken. I appreciate Heineken and Lion are the 2 in this market, but you might have a situation where, obviously Steinlager clearly wants to be seen in that broadcast, and it's not relevant for it to have Carlsberg. So effectively, this is a technology which in real time represents or re-represents what the perimeter digital signage looks like. So deals are being cut now on a country-by-country or region-by-region basis. And this is very, very clever, because suddenly it extrapolates the amount of income that a sports federation could actually get. It also deals with certain countries where there may be exclusions. So, for example, betting in France or alcohol in France. So, it's something which you should be alive to, and effectively, again, it's a revenue share model. So that's how Supernor will deal with the counterparties. But as I say, this digital billboard replacement technology really only launched in the last 12 months. I'm sure it's going to become much more relevant. And again, particularly with the sports that have an international pickup for New Zealand. Again, this move online and people's propensity to pay. What's interesting is that in terms of the movie industry, last year, for the first time, you had the movie rental industry, effectively through downloading, and courtesy of the likes of Netflix and LoveFilm, Amazon, etc., actually overtook the amount of sell-through for the movie industry. And I think people now, because of the huge proliferation of e-commerce, are much more comfortable with mini-pay. And to that extent, here's an example. Again, this was performed. This was a dead rubber, effectively, between England and Ukraine for the Euro Championships, which are about to start in June. So back in 2010, there was no take-up for this. It was a dead rubber game. The terrestrial and the pay broadcasters didn't want it. So Kentaro, the rights owner, approached Perform and said, would you effectively take the rights, which Perform duly did exclusively, and bear in mind that this didn't really mean much, the result of this game, but they were able to charge prices of between £4.99 and £11.99 on match day, obviously the early bird discount up to the match day itself, and they had over 500,000 people who paid for that. So that's, again, an example of how, okay, it's football, but I do try and re-emphasize the fact that it wasn't a critical game. It wasn't, a decisive game in any shape or form. So that obviously, again, demonstrates how readily people are prepared to pay for sport in the online world we live in. So how is this relevant to New Zealand? I mean, I think one of the other things I'd like to share with you now is a separate presentation on an initiative that I was fairly instrumental in last year, which was the launch of gbsport.tv. And this next presentation might actually be more interactive, might be an excuse for people to talk a little more. So if I just quickly... Right, so the whole principle of GB Sport TV was typically for the Olympic sports and the minority sports that only got a window once every 4 years and occasionally through World Championship events. So it was to see how we could bring together a portfolio of 12 or more sports and apply it to the British market. Obviously there's a number of sports which are marquee sports, which have no issue with their rights, but many others effectively are really just left to the sidelines, and a lot of the incumbent broadcasters will pay lip service to them. So what the concept of GB Sports was how could we address these sports? Now, obviously athletics would be considered, a tier 1 sport, and in many people's book, when it comes to Olympics, many others would also deserve that sort of profile. But outside of that 17 days of Olympic fanfare, these sports essentially don't get any exposure whatsoever. So what we decided is that we'd put together a concept whereby through aggregation, we would be able to put a portfolio of sports which actually, when you look at participation levels, very, very significant. And what we were keen to do was demonstrate that this as a thematic concept could then be replicated in other markets. So GB Sport TV could effectively be done in 100, 150 other markets where the top 20 or 30 sports that weren't getting coverage could effectively pool their resources and come up with something. And this is all, as I say, driven by the new technical platforms. It was intended to be free because, again, initially it's important with any new services to make the entry level free, to maximize penetration and to get patronage. And I think thereafter it's up to the sports federation to determine whether they want to go to a pay model. Independently, I'm involved with the Professional Squash Association. Now, we have 12 world-class events worldwide, and we've done a deal with Perform, and we've gone for effectively a pay model whereby we provide either a match day, a weekend, or a week-long season pass to any of the events that we broadcast. I think for a number of these sports, it's not inconceivable now that through micropayment, people will be quite readily prepared to part with $2, $3, $4, $5, and it's really, as I say, first of all, building up a major pool of viewer base and a database, and then determine whether there's any upselling opportunities. This can also be done not just through, as I say, an IPTV platform, but can be done through apps. And you have to remember the average premium app is only about $2. So what we were developing with this was effectively a totally unique proposition which would give GB Sport as a sort of collective, in much the same way the Olympics is, a new platform. And we teamed up with the Daily Telegraph, and we realized that the Daily Telegraph were very keen to maximize their association with sport. Also because they're not an official Olympic partner, they were very keen to get involved from a guerrilla perspective. And so in September of last year, we launched GB Sport TV, and it was launched with funding of about £500,000. The costs of production would range. Typically, the cost of producing live events. I mean, one of the first live events we did was the Association of International Boxing in Azerbaijan, the World Boxing Championships there in Baku. You'd be talking about costs of about £1,500 per hour for live broadcast. That's for an international event. Obviously, there was also a great deal of archive reclamation. What we recognise is that you would have to punctuate the schedule with some historical footage. So in terms of the normal costs of retrieving that from rival rights companies or broadcasters would be about £400 to £500 an hour. So those costs hopefully give you a rough flavour as to what producing a broadcast quality signal. So I'm not talking about the handheld personalised approach to broadcast. I'm talking about a world-class feed. Those were the sort of indicative levels. Now, obviously from our perspective, we knew that a combination of working with a media owner who already have considerable following in terms of uniques was a very good way of cross-promoting or co-promoting. I don't pretend to know how the Herald work in this country, whether they're aligned with any one or other particular broadcaster. But if you actually follow the print world, they still actually dominate because of the news and the content that they produce. So it may be logical in this market for a partnership, much the same way L'Equipe has launched Daily Motion. You might find the New Zealand Herald is a perfect partner for a New Zealand sport partnership. So you've got the offline promotion as well as their online activity, cross-promoting your own New Zealand sport channel. I think it would be very, very difficult for many sports to stand alone. I appreciate you have a rugby channel, but how many other sports could actually have a bespoke, dedicated service in this country? But I do feel now, courtesy of the internet, there's no reason why you can't have a horizontal and vertical approach so that people who are dedicated followers of athletics or canoeing or mountain biking can fulfill their appetite. Input Media, another of the partners, Input Media, effectively a production house. There are a plethora of independent production companies and wannabe companies in this country, so there's absolutely no reason why they wouldn't be a logical partner. Again, logistically, it doesn't make any sense to bring in international partners. From a production perspective, it'd just be prohibitively expensive. So I think, again, at a local level, there's no reason why you don't have the know-how and capability. So in essence, that was a way of developing the concept. And what we found that by producing basketball, boxing, a number of other events, that we were able to secure sufficient traction to make the concept viable. Obviously now, in the run-up to the Olympics, we have to wait until post-Olympics until we can see whether there's a market. I think obviously the road to London, clearly there's a lot of interest. A lot of the qualification events, a lot of the World Championship events, obviously attracting that interest. I think what we found our biggest challenge was how do we compete with the likes of YouTube? And one of the biggest challenges in the UK is just the depth of competition with YouTube, with Perform. And I don't believe, forgive me, but I don't believe there's anything like that level of online competition here per se. I appreciate that Sky Television and TVNZ effectively have a monopoly, duopoly, but I think in terms of for the minority sports, there's a window here to create now a platform which I think could be done both, as I say, on an IPTV basis as well as effectively through a YouTube platform. And yeah, just some of the various initiatives on the marketing promotion. So I think clearly that the biggest benefit that any rights owner will ever have is the exclusivity. And one of the things I think a number of the sports can deliver here is because they're just not getting any airtime is exclusivity. And that really is the currency of sport. Live, most undoubtedly, and exclusive. I think, again, as regards the apps market, we discussed it yesterday. I mean, the average app is getting about 40 to 50,000 downloads. Obviously, there's a huge spread, but where it's exclusive, and this is something you can deliver, you're likely to get much, much higher traction. I mean, I was quite surprised when Bruce mentioned there were 62,000 Twitter followers and 200,000 Facebook followers. That's only 10% penetration of the universe of people in New Zealand. So I would have thought that the sports themselves could very likely eclipse and surpass those numbers. And for it to be viable, as I say, if the cost of an application is now coming down, you can put together a very good app for $10,000 or less. So whether it's a sponsored app or whether it's a premium app, my inclination would be to start with a free app and then upsell from there, because as I say, I think that there's an enormous opportunity there. So I would strongly advocate that a lot of the sports funding mechanisms that could be done will either be through classic sponsorship, but because of the production values, the sort of sponsorship that is required, maybe only $25,000, $50,000, and still allow the sports to garner a very significant income stream thereafter. Nothing else there. So yeah, that was just one of the other more recent projects I've been involved with. I don't know if there are any questions that come out of that at all.
Chris, one question that springs to mind, obviously in the UK, was private sector partnerships that drove that concept and made it reality. Again, obviously that reflects on what we spoke about yesterday in terms of risk, entrepreneurship. Do you think that the most likely way for that to happen here would be through a similar partnership with the private sector here in New Zealand, or do you think it might be from someone like GVSport.tv saying, no, we could look at this model and help initiate it in other countries, as you mentioned, as you were looking at, but still letting it grow and be an independent model here in New Zealand?
I think it's all about an alliance, and I think if you can bring together the collective of sports bodies that want to buy into this, so the various sports, and there are probably 20 or so represented here this week, together with a major media owner that isn't an established broadcaster, and it would seem to me that the national press is the most relevant, but not to the exclusion of the regional markets. And I do feel that that the production values and costs make the whole proposition viable. I sense now that the private sector wouldn't be called on for the sort of quantum of money that ordinarily they'd expect to have to put up. So there's no reason why a lot of advertisers or sponsors couldn't get involved, at a much lower threshold than previously would have been the case. And I think it's really, with that in mind, together with, trying to get a key database of the people who are, genuinely engaged. Do they want this? Is there a market demand for this? I think your research would demonstrate that there probably is. I think YouTube and the amount of video that's being uploaded is clearly demonstrable of that fact as well. So I think it's a great opportunity, but there needs to be a structure, and I think New Zealand Sport can provide that umbrella structure. As I say, at one end of the spectrum you have rugby with its own 24/7 channel effectively, I think we have to be realistic and recognise that the other sports can't necessarily aspire to that in a classic digital television world, but there's no reason why they can't become competitive. And I think on an aggregation basis, it makes absolute sense for them to cooperate and form an alliance. And New Zealand Sport has the franchise to do that.
Chris, I'm really interested in the connection with the national sporting bodies as part of GV Sport. Effectively, that's what you've got here.
Yeah.
You're the entrepreneur, we've got the content. Typically, we've not been that commercial about what we do. We normally sell the rights to Sky or TV1, and they do everything for us, and we try and chop the ticket. So I'm interested in this new model, and clearly the production is a critical component about how you can best present your sport. And obviously the channels are there. I'm interested in how your conversations went with the national sporting bodies in the UK. And what was good, what was not good, where did you find people that were ready to go and those that were a bit resistant? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, of the sort of 12 sports, Peter, that we identified, I think, we were pushing on an open door. There were some sports, notably athletics, who already had existing deals. And I think there was a high degree of sensitivity because of the Olympics, and a sense of not wanting to commit, because if there was ever a time for these sports to perhaps reprice themselves, then it would be on the back of a successful Olympics. So in some respects, we were maybe either too late or too early, coming to the various associations and federations, because, Britain has traditionally done very well in a number of sports like cycling or rowing, boxing, etc., in terms of medal tally, and they perhaps had a somewhat inflated opinion of what their worth might be. I think also, given the introduction of Perform in the marketplace, and Perform effectively were coming with minimum guarantees, they were able to put down 250, 300, 350,000 pounds, which was manna from heaven for a lot of these sports. So we found that was a competitive challenge. As I say, given it's a different betting climate down here, I guess that competitive threat doesn't currently exist. I think also people were holding out for YouTube. YouTube were making lots of noises, but they only made this transition into a sports-focused approach 4 or 5 months ago. So we were sort of caught between. They all wanted to do it. It was a question of who would be their best partners. Now, a number of them offered it non-exclusively, but there's just no merit in us taking it non-exclusive when you're competing with the YouTubes or even the traditional, you shouldn't forget skysports.com has 17 million monthly users. So I think the concept definitely has validity. I think in terms of the markets in which it can be deployed, ironically, probably the UK was the most difficult market to start with. And you might find that less competitive markets, when I mean less competitive in the sense of the media landscape, from an online perspective, might be a better place to start. So I think what's true now is I'm working with the English Boxing Association, the EABA, and they're very committed to the YouTube approach. It's something that they want to do. And they know that for them, they have to look at their calendar and work out which of the events to invest in higher quality production values. So be they, national championships or equivalent.
What it suggests to me then is that national sporting bodies are going to have to get more into the game of production and understanding how they can do that low cost.
Yeah.
You talk about obviously those sort of organisations here in New Zealand, but that needs to be then really a core competency of the sport to understand how it puts it together and the right look for that low cost.
Yeah, and I think given you can amortise the cost across the sports, I think to have a centralised production capability must make sense rather than a cost-plus model. So, the beauty of mobile units now and the declining cost of production per hour, not at the expense of quality. Ironically, that's it's inverse to that. You will find that from your own calendar, you'll work out what the pinch points are, where you might have to subcontract or you might need additional satellite capacity. But in the main, I would have thought it's well within your capability to manage the portfolio of events.
I just had a question about observations about the balance between the live and the broadcast experience, and what impact ultimately you see having on sport. We follow a conversation here, which is a small market in some areas about actually, look at this, I'm not paying that toll, I just watch it on television.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see, as it becomes better quality, 3D, more ubiquitous, do you see that ultimately having a negative impact on sport?
I think, live obviously is very relevant for the major sports. I think for a lot of sports, like take for example the Winter Games, how important is it for New Zealand Winter Games to be live necessarily? I think it's more debatable. I think the in-home experience for the big world-class sports, it's going to be very hard to to replicate that. I mean, take, for example, this year, the Super Bowl. 111 million people watched the Super Bowl. It was the first year ever that NBC had done a live simulcast of the Super Bowl online. They only had 2.1 million people watch it online. And what's more, those people didn't get to see the Madonna halftime show or the ads, which were a major draw of the Super Bowl. So the experience that NBC found was that there were also accusations that there was anything between a 30 and 45-second lag of the online viewing experience to the live viewing experience. So people through social media, through Twitter, which is effectively more or less real time, would be sharing that experience with people who obviously didn't know that they were lagging the real-time going watching it online. And I think something like the Super Bowl, it's the big screen, it's the big experience. I mean, in much the same way that the New Zealand Rugby World Cup final was the most viewed event ever, this year's Super Bowl was the most viewed event ever. I think 160 million people at peak watched it, 111 million was the average. So what's interesting is when you juxtapose the traditional television experience against the online experience, that's when you're dealing with 60-inch screens versus 13-inch.
My question was more about actual in-stadium people.
Right.
Opening up to the stadium and actually making the decision now that this has become, too hard, too expensive. I'll just, sit at home and
Yeah, I think what in-stadia are doing, and obviously it's evidenced at, say, Formula One with Kangaroo television and other devices, that people now, even with golf tournaments, it's very difficult to take mobile phones and other devices off people. It happened at the Celtic Manor Ryder Cup, as you and I experienced, but it's very difficult to frisk people to the nth degree. I mean, it's just logistically very, very difficult, particularly at stadia holding 50, 60, 70, 80,000 people. I think what's happening now is that the sports companies and federations are investing more in Wi-Fi in stadia. At the moment, we've all been there, you can't even make a call. It's typically very, very difficult to get a signal when you're at a live sporting event. A number of the US companies now are investing heavily because they recognize that people in their seat want to see the replays. They want to see, other viewing angles. So it's very probable people will go, not necessarily with tablets, but they'll go with their smartphones and they'll expect to see, provided, courtesy of the stadium, all of those things that we take for granted in the living room. And I think that's a way of perhaps making the experience in stadium more compelling. So you get the double advantage of I'm there, yes, and I saw the replay. Because how many of us have watched a game live, then gone home to just watch the highlights or the rebroadcast? I mean, that's not atypical.
So actually, sports are quite innovative with this, could benefit by increasing audiences, especially if, as you're suggesting, there's a swing away from the living room to people with remote devices.
Yeah, and I think also, particularly at golf tournaments, it's one of the most unsatisfying experiences is watching live golf, and I watch a lot of live golf at competitions. And you ultimately resort back to the clubhouse because you can see what is happening concurrently with multiple camera feeds, etc., etc. But what they've done, particularly in Korea, they've recently had the Ballantines Championship in South Korea this last weekend, and there people on any device, tablet, smartphone, etc., they can effectively call up any hotel, any hole, 1 to 18, see what's happening. And so there's actually a market on course now, and that's a premium service, so people effectively are paying for that. Now, obviously, broadband speeds in Korea make that entirely feasible. It's not necessarily the case in other markets at the moment, but that's a flavour of what the live experience could potentially provide. And I think the consumer deserves it and certainly demands it because there's so much going on that they're not capturing at the moment. Okay. So Peter, what are you thinking?
That's fascinating. Fascinating. I think what I'm trying to do is still think it from the national sporting perspective. I think what you've done is open up, in my mind, the potential for a lot of sports that are here. Certainly the minor sports in New Zealand really struggle to get stuff online, on TV. And what I think you've done is represent a
I think also from a sponsor perspective, let's say you were to take like the top program or Champions League model and say, right, we want 6 sponsors who are going to put $250,000 up. Now, I'm trying to come up with a number that sounds reasonable and not too gratuitous, but with that $1.5 million, how much could you produce? And really, that's where you might get 1,000 hours of quality live broadcast. There's only 8,000 hours in a year, 24/7, 365. So you could say that we're going to have these as our flagship events for those given sports, and then we're going to wrap that around with a lot of user-generated content. I think that absolutely is legitimate. A lot of archive material, but it's more the heroes. How many people, in fairness, in this country actually know who the New Zealand Olympic team representatives are? They probably know the half dozen or so medal prospects, but there's all of those people that aren't properly leveraged, who'd be great commentators, great spokespeople. There's so much programming that can be produced so cost effectively. And I think there's everyone, brand New Zealand would be so strong. New Zealand sport, who in the country wouldn't want to engage with that?
So I just follow on from what Pete was saying. I think, I think the sports organisations a lot want to go on television. And it's not necessarily for revenue, it's for profile.
Yeah.
And I guess what I picked up was that television actually isn't necessarily the medium that you need to go to, but there's other mediums, which then comes back to the issue of how do you get your production in a way which still means it's attractive to the new medium.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's where your sponsorship and things like that
I think to give you certainty, if you could sign up 3-5 year commitments from sponsors who, it's in much the same way if New Zealand were bidding for a Commonwealth Games in the future or whatever, you'd have the same issues, and I'm sure Rugby World Cup had it, where you've got to have partners that want to become actively involved. And hopefully they're sort of agnostic in terms of which sport. If they realise it's a collective, the A to Z of New Zealand sport, it's all good for the country, they want to support the community, then that sort of approach, and I'm not saying it's 6, it might be 10, it might be 20, but literally sharing that pool would give you visibility of income to know that then you've got a budget to work to. And I'm not saying that there isn't a revenue model from advertising or subscription. I honestly believe there would be. And I think 4 million people, is it beyond the wit that perhaps 50% of them might pay $1 or $2 a year, a month? I mean, it's significant income when you pro forma it, but I think it's a small enough contribution that people would think, okay, we're doing this. And I'm sure you can tie in charitable angles. There's all number of other initiatives you can undertake, and you obviously have all the know-how to do that. But I feel that you can put together for a relatively small, modest budget, a very compelling proposition. Because at the moment, if you do get airtime, you're going to get cough-in time anyway, because you're competing head-to-head with the major sports. But for a lot of the consumers that want to have the opportunity of following their sports that they're largely participant in anyway, you would suddenly have another platform. And it's very hard to have appointment viewing. At the moment, linear television is appointment viewing, and 90% of all catch-up viewing is within an hour of that program finishing, ironically. So people are still accustomed to, right, this time, this day, and that means that for the minority sports, they're not going to get a look in. You might get a look in, as I say, between 12 and 3 a.m. or something. Whereas if they can go to a dedicated site, it's there whenever they want to watch it.
Is it more appropriate to get an entrepreneur, an expert like yourself, into drive this kind of concept, or would it be better for Sport New Zealand to take it on itself? There will be a lot of front work involved.
No, I mean, the only point I would say is, yes, obviously the experience we've had is something that we can legitimately share with Peter and the team. I think you've got all the capability here as a body of major sports. I think you'll all have past experiences of television. I think in terms of production companies, again, through normal tender or beauty parade process, you're going to come up with those, because I don't think it's a one-stop shop, because there are people who are specialists in certain disciplines, in certain sports, be they field-based or mountain-based or water-based. So I would be almost inclining you towards having a portfolio of companies. And that, there are lots of incredibly talented people. I mean, within the various specialty degrees, the internships. So there's so many ways in which you can actually create your own talent pool. There's a very good site actually called Talent House, and that is becoming a very popular portal whereby they're asking the consumer to actually post their best fashion designs, their best commercials, and creating that sort of competition. New Zealand Sport could do, looking for the best new sports producer or whatever it may be. That's in many respects how Flickr really started. So I think you've got to harness what's already out there, what you have in the country. So I'm not trying to do myself out of a role. Of course I'd love to be, but I'm not so presumptuous as to assume that the solutions aren't very readily here.
I don't know if I can answer that question, but ultimately the market needs to be there, and that's why I was really interested in the national sporting body. Typically what we've been told in the past, a little bit of frustration, is around not being able to convince TV to put it on, so it couldn't become part of their program or schedule because it was precious and it didn't have enough capacity, and two, the production costs were too high. What you've just said is there are two ways of overcoming it. So it seems to me we've got a way through that solution. So we're going to come up to national bodies and go, right, how would we embrace that? How would we build on the back of it, social media strategy that can attract more people to watch? So I think I think this thing we have to think through a little bit carefully. I'm really more interested in your experiences from the end user, the sports perspective, and how they've gone about it.
But from a monetization point of view, as crude as it is, when you actually look at the value that's being attributed to some of the new media companies, so take, for example, Facebook, circa $100 billion valuation with circa 1 billion users. There's about $100 value per user. So if hypothetically New Zealand Sport had 4 million